There was a time when our family felt like something straight out of a sitcom. Tight-knit, full of laughter, and seemingly unbreakable. But all of that changed in 2003 when a betrayal so deep shattered the foundation we once stood on. My father, who was in his mid-50s at the time, had built his entire world around his marriage and family. He believed in love, in loyalty, in the kind of devotion that withstands the test of time. But everything came crashing down when he discovered that my mother had been having an affair. And not just with anyone, but with his best friend since childhood, John. John wasn't just some acquaintance. He was like family to us. He had been my father's confidant, his best man at his wedding, someone he had trusted for decades. So, when the truth came out, it wasn't just a betrayal. It was an earthquake that split our lives in two. Desperate to salvage what was left, my father begged my mother to stay, pleaded with her to work things out, to not throw away decades of marriage over a mistake. But she had already made up her mind. Within months of the divorce, she had married John. It was as if she had erased my father from her life overnight. For my twin sister Sarah and me, the fallout was immediate. At 26 years old, we were the last of our siblings still living at home, and we were now faced with a choice neither of us had ever imagined making. Who would we live with? Sarah had always been a daddy's girl, his favorite, his pride and joy. If anyone had asked, they would have assumed without a doubt that she would stand by him. But when the dust settled, she made a decision that shocked everyone. She chose to live with our mother and John. No one understood it, not even me. It felt like she had turned her back on the man who had loved her unconditionally. I, on the other hand, stayed with my father, watching him struggle to hold himself together, trying to rebuild the broken pieces of his life. At first, Sarah would still visit us on weekends, but over time, those visits became fewer, then stopped altogether. Somewhere along the way, my father made a painful decision. He disowned her. And now, years later, he is dying, and I am stuck in the impossible position of trying to convince my sister to say goodbye to the father who had cast her out. Years passed, and what once seemed like a temporary fracture in our family became an unbridgeable canyon of silence. Sarah had made her choice, and while I never stopped being her brother, our relationship suffered under the weight of everything that had happened. For a while, I tried to maintain contact with her, reaching out with phone calls, occasional texts, even suggesting family meetups. But every conversation carried an underlying tension, as if we were both stepping carefully around landmines of unresolved emotions. She refused to talk about our father, and I could tell that part of her still resented him for disowning her. Meanwhile, my father had changed in ways I never could have anticipated. The betrayal had broken something inside him. The man who had once been full of life, the father who had always been our rock, now seemed like a hollow version of himself. He buried himself in work, in solitude, in anything that would distract him from the gaping void that my mother and John had left behind. He never remarried, never even entertained the idea of dating again. It was as if he had resigned himself to living in the shadow of his past. And then, last month, everything changed. The doctors gave us the news none of us were prepared for. Stage 4 cancer. The kind that comes with no real options, no last-minute miracles. Just a slow, painful countdown to the inevitable. He had months, maybe weeks. As I sat beside his hospital bed, taking in the frailness of the man who had once been the strongest person I knew, he did something I never thought he would do. He asked about Sarah. "How is she?" he asked, his voice weak, eyes distant. "Is she happy?" The question caught me off guard. For years, he had refused to acknowledge her, acting as if she had ceased to exist the moment she chose our mother. But now, in the face of death, it was as if he could no longer hold on to his resentment. "You should call her," I said cautiously, unsure of how he would react. It's not too late. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. She made her choice. But if she wants to see me before I go, I won't stop her. I knew what he meant. It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. He wouldn't reach out, wouldn't make the first move. If Sarah wanted closure, she would have to come to him. And so, I found myself standing outside my sister's home, preparing for the most difficult conversation of my life. Standing outside Sarah's house, I felt a tension coil in my chest, a mixture of anxiety and exhaustion weighing me down. I hadn't seen her in person for years, and now I was here, about to ask her to face a man she had spent over a decade trying to forget. I knocked, and when she opened the door, there was a brief moment of hesitation, a flicker of surprise, then guarded caution. We had spoken occasionally over the years, but visits had become so rare that I almost felt like a stranger standing on her doorstep. "Oi, hey," I said, my voice softer than I expected. She nodded, stepping aside to let me in, her expression unreadable. The moment I sat down in her living room, I knew I had to choose my words carefully. I wasn't here to stir old wounds, to bring up the pain of the past. I was here for one reason. It's Dad, I said finally, watching as she stiffened, her fingers tightening around the armrest of the couch. "He's dying, Sarah. Stage 4. There's not much time left." She didn't respond right away. Her face remained neutral, but I could see the way her breathing changed, the way her shoulders tensed slightly, as if bracing for impact. "And?" she asked, her voice clipped, distant. "And I think you should see him," I said, leaning forward, my elbows resting on my knees. "Whatever happened between you two, it doesn't have to end like this. You don't have to live the rest of your life knowing you never got to say goodbye." She let out a slow, controlled breath, shaking her head. "He disowned me. He made it clear a long time ago that I wasn't his daughter anymore. So why does it matter now?" Her words stung, but I couldn't blame her for feeling this way. The wounds ran deep, and I knew they wouldn't heal overnight. "You know why it matters," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "Because you'll regret it if you don't. Because no matter how angry you are, no matter how much time has passed, he was still your father." She scoffed, shaking her head again. "You think I don't regret it? You think I wanted this?" Her voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, I saw the pain she had been holding on to all these years. I exhaled, softening my tone. "Then don't let it end like this, Sarah. Go see him. Do it for yourself, if not for him." She didn't respond right away. Her gaze was distant, lost in thought, and I knew I had given her something to wrestle with. I just hoped it wasn't too late. Silence hung between us, stretching for what felt like an eternity as Sarah stared down at the floor, lost in her own thoughts. I could see the war raging inside her, the bitterness that had hardened over the years, colliding with the undeniable truth that time was running out. "You don't get it," she finally said, her voice quieter now, filled with something that sounded dangerously close to hesitation. "He didn't just cut me off. He erased me. He acted like I never existed. And now, I'm supposed to just… what? Walk back into his life because he's dying?" I leaned forward, my hands clasped together as I met her gaze. "I know it's not that simple, but if you don't go now, there won't be another chance. Whether you think he deserves it or not, this isn't just about him anymore. It's about you. You need closure, Sarah. You need to face him, or this will haunt you for the rest of your life." She let out a short, bitter laugh, rubbing her hands over her face. "You think seeing him will magically fix everything? That suddenly, I won't feel like I spent the last decade being punished for a choice I made when I was barely old enough to understand the consequences. No, I admitted. But it might give you something to hold on to when he's gone. Right now, all you have is anger and resentment. Maybe facing him will give you something more than that. I could see the cracks forming in her resolve, the walls she had built over the years beginning to falter. She wanted to fight back, to stay firm in her anger. But deep down, I knew she had never stopped loving him. No matter how much she had tried to convince herself otherwise, he was still our father. If I go, she said after a long pause, I'm not going for him. I'm going for me. I nodded. That's all I'm asking. She exhaled sharply, standing up, her decision made. Let's go before I change my mind. The drive to the hospital was quiet, filled with unspoken tension, unsaid words, and emotions too complex to express. Sarah stared out the window, her fingers fidgeting in her lap, and though she said nothing, I could tell her mind was racing. She was preparing herself for something she had sworn she would never do, facing the father who had once abandoned her. When we arrived, I led the way through the sterile, dimly lit corridors, my heart pounding with every step. This was it, the moment that would define their relationship forever. I didn't know how my father would react. Would he be cold? Would he regret his choices? Would this meeting heal old wounds or deepen them? I pushed open the hospital room door, and there he was, a frail, shrunken version of the man who had once seemed indestructible. His eyes were closed, his breathing labored, his body barely a shadow of what it had once been. At the sound of the door, he stirred, his gaze slowly shifting toward us. And then he saw her. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. His expression flickered, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally, something I hadn't seen in years. Regret. Sarah. His voice was hoarse, weak, but filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Sarah didn't move at first. She stood frozen at the threshold, as if torn between stepping forward and turning back. But then, she exhaled and walked toward him, stopping at the foot of his bed. You're really here, he whispered, his gaze never leaving her face. She nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah, I'm here. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate apologies, just two people who had been separated by time, pain, and stubbornness, finally seeing each other for who they were, not for the mistakes they had made. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice breaking in a way that said more than words ever could. 4. The first time in years, Sarah let go of the anger she had been carrying. She reached for his hand, gripping it gently, and in that moment, I knew. This was the closure they both had needed. No matter what happened next, they had found their way back to each other.